Good morning. Welcome to Historical Perspectives on Artificial Intelligence, an online congressional briefing by the American Historical Association. I'm Sarah Weichsel. I'm the Executive Director of the AHA. The AHA's Congressional Briefings program provides congressional staff, journalists, and others in the policy community with historical background necessary to understand the context of current legislative concerns. This online iteration of the series will bring that focus to our expanded audience. We had planned to host this briefing in person today, and we hope to reschedule it once the government reopens. The AHA's briefing program rests on the premise that everything has a history, and that includes the issues that face Congress. Our second premise is that historical context is nonpartisan, and our briefings are unencumbered with any particular legislative agenda. Our speakers will adhere to that standard. The AHA is grateful to the Mellon Foundation for the funding that makes this work possible, and to the Center for American Political History, Media, and Technology at Purdue University for their support for this particular briefing. The discussion today will be moderated by Kathryn Cramer Brownell, Professor of History at Purdue University and Director of the university's Center for American Political History, Media, and Technology. Kathryn Brownell's research and teaching focus on the relationships between media, politics, and popular culture, with an emphasis on the American presidency. Her most recent book, 24/7 Politics, Cable Television and the Fragmenting of America, From Watergate to Fox News, explores the political battle over cable television from the 1960s through today, excavating how the American political process became tethered to the business interests of a corporate cable television industry. She also serves as senior editor for the Made by History column at Time magazine. Now I'll hand things over to Dr. Brownell.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Sarah Weichsel and the AHA for your leadership at such a crucial juncture for the historical profession, and for putting on programs like this that serve such an important place for scholars to show the significance of their work in the contemporary landscape. AI is on the minds of educators, policymakers, business leaders, and workers, as we are all thinking through how it changes the nature of education and work. But what about the nature of citizenship, and especially how to balance, as a policy question, rights of privacy and the rights of citizenship with the imperative of national security and the operations of the modern surveillance state? What tensions and contradictions emerge, and how might a historical lens help us understand the origins, consequences, and stakes of these current conversations around new technology and its relationship to privacy and national security? Today, we have an amazing lineup of scholars to help us dig into these questions and to provide much needed historical context to remind us that technology does not chart its own course. People, policymakers make choices over how to use and structure new technology, and understanding these historical dynamics and the context that shape their available choices can help us better navigate these policy questions today. So we have an incredible panelist that will offer insights over the next half hour. And then we will open it up for questions. You can pose questions in the question and answer boxes during their remarks, and then we will have time for a conversation at the end of their presentations. First, we will have Sarah Igoe, who is the Andrew Jackson Chair in American History at Vanderbilt University and has served as Dean of Strategic Initiatives for the university's College of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Igoe teaches and writes about modern U.S. cultural, legal, and political history with a special interest in human sciences, the sociology of knowledge, and the public sphere. Her books include The Known Citizen, A History of Privacy in Modern America, and The Averaged American, Surveys, Citizens, and the Making of the Mass Public. Rebecca Slayton is Associate Professor in Cornell University's Science and Technology Studies Department. Her research and teaching examine the relationships between and among risk, governance, and expertise, with a focus on international security and cooperation since World War II. Her first book was Arguments That Count: Physics, Computing, and Missile Defense, 1949 to 2012. And her current projects include a history of cybersecurity expertise and another on the creation of the smart electrical power grid. Aaron Mendon-Plasek is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Purdue University. His first book project, tentatively titled The Ill-Defined World, A History of Machine Learning and Novel Political Knowledge, examines how little-known communities of transnational researchers sought to build learning machines that linked efficacy to visions of subjectivity. The book traces how these schemes of quantification would go on to remake contemporary AI, scientific inquiry, and the ways that societies know themselves. As was previously mentioned, we had planned this as a congressional briefing, which is such an important AHA initiative that the Center for American Political History, Media, and Technology at Purdue is so proud to support because it brings historical analysis and thinking to contemporary policy debates. Of course, because of the government shutdown, we've pivoted to this online conversation, but I hope this webinar will be informative to all participants and also remind them of the value of these congressional briefings. I assign them regularly in my classes, and there's an archive on the AHA website of past briefings, and there's such incredible resources. So I really encourage you to dig into them and to explore them after this webinar. They also remind us of the importance of public engagement by scholars and the value that historians have in charting out the policy terrain we face today and in the future. Before I turn the floor over to Dr. Igo, I just want to remind you, please share your questions that you have for the panelists in the Q&A box. And we will use them for a very vibrant discussion following their presentations. All right, Dr. Igo.
Wonderful. Thank you to Katie Brownell and to the AHA and to all of you for tuning in. Really glad to be here, even if virtually. So I'm going to share my screen here so that you can see, I hope, see if we can get that going. Yes. A few photographs and images that I think, sorry, I'm not seeing where I can start the show. One second. Here we go. Okay, hoping everybody can see that. I wanted to begin with a few images that I think capture well today's concerns about AI and its implications for Americans' privacy and security. I'm going to put the problem simply, probably too simply, as one of accelerating and unrestrained data collection and exploitation. And we can see this in facial recognition technologies, predictive algorithms, chatbots, deepfakes, and so on. It's a problem for which current regulatory frameworks often seem to be no match. Okay, so so having shown you a few images that I think will be somewhat familiar to most of you, I'm just going to leave these worrisome developments aside and transport us into the late 19th century. This was an era like ours of disruptive technological change, complete with massive private entities that conveyed, bought, and sold information for profit. It's also the moment, I would argue, when modern privacy begins and becomes one of our kind of political debates that is ongoing. Now, before the Civil War, most Americans seem to have understood privacy as closely linked to their property lines and their immediate physical environment. The rise of the mass media and a host of new technologies would unsettle established lines between public and private. Particularly important here were new virtual invasions, telegraph lines, telephone wires, recording devices, the tabloid press, and what contemporaries called instantaneous photography. Let's see if I can move this along to show you a few images of these virtual invasions. So to begin with the telegraph and the telephone, these were incredible innovations, which allowed information to travel much more swiftly and smoothly than they had ever before. But they also traveled these private messages and information much less securely than they had before. Telegraphy posed a now familiar trade-off between convenience and privacy. It required the disclosure of the contents of one's message to a third party, and companies kept copies, which might exist in 3 or 4 locations. Those copies, as it turned out, would also be subject to government subpoenas. This would lead one historian to label the telegraph network the Victorian internet, and there are, in fact, many, many analogies. Just a few years later was the commercial introduction of the telephone. This launched, according to one observer, once and for all, an era of electronic exhibitionism and voyeurism, a resonant comment from the late 19th century. This was because of the party lines where neighbors could listen in on each other, and you maybe get a little bit of a sense of that reaching in from this AT&T ad from the early days of the telephone. There were other listeners too. Tapping telephone wires became a practice of the police and of criminals as well, and the government on occasion on national security grounds. This would actually spawn a whole genre of literature, and you can see a photograph of one of the titles on the left of the wire thriller. People intercepting and grabbing information not meant for them from the wires. So a public debate would soon be sparked by these practices of interception. The question being, did information that traveled over wires or cables deserve the same kind of legal protections as written correspondence? It took a while, but the Supreme Court eventually weighed in 1928 and said no, that wiretapping was not a privacy invasion because it made no physical intrusion. Spoken words were not material things, and telephone wires, in fact, extended outside one's physical private residence. I mention this because of the gap time, the lag time sometimes in really understanding what new technologies were and what they could do. That ruling of the court would not be overturned until 1967. So other technologies of the day were also changing the terms of privacy. I want to mention just briefly new technologies of capture. There was a novel ability by the late 19th century to store and disseminate things that had once been ephemeral. If you think about the phonograph and its ability to capture and record and play back a human voice, for example. More alarming at the time was the dissemination of the personal image through instantaneous photography. In the mid-19th century, photography had been slow and cumbersome. Subjects had to sit for a photo and they couldn't be caught unawares. But the shrinking of exposure times in the 1880s, another kind of amazing development of this time period, meant that picture taking no longer required a cooperative subject or actually much expertise in order to snap a photo. So amateur photography would take off with the Brownie camera seen here on the right, as does a whole trend of surreptitious photo taking. Marketed devices to allow people to disguise a camera and take photographs unawares. These even had a name, detective cameras, and you can see a couple of images of them here. Another photographic development also appeared in the 1880s, and this was the development of the newspaper halftone, which allowed photographs to be cheaply reprinted in the press. And this would open the floodgates for the mass circulation of images, authorized or not, and accompanying stories of sex, crime, and celebrity. You can see some of the headlines in this political cartoon: the morning cyclone of crime, the daily scandal monger, and the like. So the scandal press, along with all of these other technologies I've just briefly sketched, raised the possibility, the new possibility of undesirable exposure and publicity of one's private affairs. And I haven't even mentioned, but I will just briefly, the trade in personal names and addresses in the 1880s, not a product of our time at all, but of a couple centuries ago, of the collection and harvesting of personal information for direct marketing by magazine publishers. A final technology I want to mention are, because it's come back to the fore, are biometric technologies. This too was an innovation of the 1890s. Fingerprinting was a technique that made biometric identification possible, along with a powerful new tool for individual tracking and surveillance. So new technologies, then as today, seem to make matter-of-fact expectations of privacy obsolete for Americans. But it's really important to notice that they also generated new defenses and innovations, and sometimes expansive new understandings of what was properly private and deserved protection. So I want to note two pioneers here in the law, Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis, Boston lawyers who would articulate the first modern call for a right to privacy. According to these Boston lawyers, novel methods of intrusion, recording devices, instantaneous photography, and aggressive press had, quote, invaded the sacred precincts of private and domestic life. And they would call for a legal remedy, what they called a right to be let alone. Warren and Brandeis will argue for the need to protect something beyond mere property rights, something less tangible, and something more ephemeral, what they called the inviolable personality. So I want to underscore, more than a century before the framing of a right to be forgotten for digital age citizens, these lawyers were developing the notion of a right to one's image, one's personality, and one's reputation. And in fact, this right would resonate broadly. A bill to protect ladies, probably not how we would frame it today, but was introduced in the US House of Representatives in 1888 to bar women's images from being used in commerce without their consent, for example. And indeed, a whole host of right to privacy suits will arrive in the wake of Warren and Brandeis's article. Suits that were brought typically by individuals whose images were used without authorization to advertise products, from soap to cigarettes. And there are a couple of examples here. One early case was on the right. Marion Manola was the woman's name. She was a stage actress who was photographed in tights without her knowledge or authorization and brought suit for the unwanted circulation of her image on a postcard. In 1902, more famously, Abigail Roberson, here pictured on the right, lodged a similar complaint in New York against Franklin Mills Flour. Roberson cited the making of 25,000 lithographic prints, photographs, and likenesses of herself without her knowledge, which were then displayed in stores, saloons, and other public venues. And one of the kind of amazing facts about this case was that she only learned about the advertising campaign when she glimpsed her own image on a neighbor's bag of flour. So this losing control of one's image, of one's information, again, is very much a product of this period in the 19th century. Now, Roberson claimed great distress and suffering to have lost control of her image and took the company to court. A sympathetic lower court would in fact note the novelty of her claim, but still rule in her favor, judging that her right of privacy had been violated. But a judge would then overturn that victory. And I think that his reasoning is telling and worth repeating. This judge dismissed what he derided as a so-called right of privacy for what he called a preposterous claim. And here is the preposterous claim. That a man has a right to pass through this world, if he wills, without having his picture published, his business enterprises discussed, his successful experiments written up for the benefit of others, or his eccentricities commented upon, either in handbills, circulars, catalogs, periodicals, or newspapers. In a mass-mediated world, that is, a world of invisible, virtual capture by new technologies, perhaps there was no feasible claim to one's image or movements or privacy. The same case is made today by the marketers of today's facial recognition tools and the scrapers of publicly available data. Others argue today that new technologies and the collecting of identifying information can't be reined in because of other public interests, whether the interests of commerce or freedom of speech or public newsworthiness, or because the technology for capture is already out there being deployed. It's a genie that sort of escaped the bottle. Yet the fear of embarrassing or intimate or shameful images or information making their way to a broader public endures in our struggles over social media, cyberbullying, revenge porn, and deepfakes. And so the questions Roberson's lawsuit raised more than a century ago are ones we're still asking. Who has the right to possess, consume, or circulate one's image and information? And what right do we have as citizens to our own reputation? I'm going to close by saying that just as Warren and Brandeis had hoped, public outcries about new surveillance technologies have sparked innovative remedies. Public outrage about the Roberson decision would in fact lead the New York legislature to pass the nation's first privacy tort, allowing individuals to sue for the invasion of privacy where their name, portrait, or picture was used without consent for purposes of trade. And indeed, in the century since, we've seen the very definition of privacy expand dramatically, from a focus on property and physical space to one's image and personality, one's psychological freedom, one's decisional autonomy, and one's official records and digital identity. What I hope this brief historical tour reveals is that virtual transgressions, unauthorized information flows, and government and corporate surveillance of citizens are not inventions of our present. And the reason to revisit them is that, of course, they didn't end. Technological innovations have in the ensuing century probed still more deeply and powerfully into individuals' lives, as our other presenters will suggest. The 1960s will be another moment of real and serious public debate about laws, norms, and regulations, that might safeguard individuals' personal data. And I think our moment of generative AI is another such opportunity. I think the most useful history to draw on here is not necessarily the echoes and parallels and analogies to past technologies, but rather these other patterns that my presentation may suggest, how threats to privacy and therefore security have often been recognized and debated and even litigated, but just as often pushed aside, lobbied against, overwritten, or ignored for other kinds of public considerations: order, efficiency, comfort, or profit. A reluctance to regulate the private and commercial sphere as opposed to the public sphere, even though the very first right to privacy suits came because of commercial evasions, and maybe the inattention and lack of imagination about the ways that new technologies might differ from and change our spheres of privacy than did the old. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Igo, and I will now turn it over to Dr. Slayton.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to get my slides up here. All right, and get this going. Okay, can everybody see that all right? Okay, great. All right, well, thank you, Sarah, for kicking us off and really laying the groundwork really nicely for our understanding of how conceptions of privacy and what our rights are in the United States have been shaped for a really long time by different technological innovations. So I'm going to pick up a little bit later, sort of mid-20th century, from where Sarah left off, and talk about the 1960s, when we started to be concerned about digital computers in particular posing threats to privacy and security. And this is what computers looked like at the time. They weren't symbols of free expression. You didn't have an iPad and a screen. They were the big boxy things that were really symbols of bureaucratic depersonalization and even dehumanization. So when the United States proposed, the federal government proposed, creating a centralized database to allow federal agencies to share information about individuals, which made a lot of sense because each of these machines was really expensive. And if you have to duplicate them throughout the government, that's a lot of money. So it makes sense to share it all, right? Efficiency. But that provoked a huge debate about the impacts of computerization on privacy. And at one major computing conference, one congressional representative argued that America has always represented for me a place where an individual could change his mind, his beliefs, and outlook on life, and still be able to live as a free and valuable component of our society. The America I have described cannot be the same America after a centralized computer system, a system which neither forgives nor forgets, is introduced. So some computer scientists actually spoke out about this argument and said this wasn't actually the threat that we needed to be worried about. And so in 1966, Paul Barron, a computer scientist at Rand, argued that today we can see the independent, private, automated information systems being interconnected to form larger growing systems, which are in many ways more dangerous than the single data bank now being considered. And so his point was that the argument over a centralized government database was really not the primary thing that we needed to worry about. And in case anybody's wondering why we should care about Paul Barron's ideas, he was the mathematician who came up with the decentralized architecture, which is now the basis for the internet. And here's an image of him in 2009 describing different kinds of network architectures. So I start with this historical moment because it's a reminder that the infrastructures that enable AI today were under development 6 decades ago. And we were worried then. So Barron's warning came really 10 years before the internet began as an experimental research network, 30 years before the internet was handed over to private management, and roughly 40 years before the establishment of major social media companies. And throughout this period, as the internet is growing and networked computers are growing and increasingly becoming interconnected, we have many waves of excitement about artificial intelligence, which takes many different forms during these decades. So the current wave today focuses on neural networks or machine learning. And so what most distinguishes it is its dependence from the past, is its dependence on vast amounts of data and processing power. So the basic models underlying AI were developed actually several decades ago, but it's really only after the development of the internet that we have these machine learning models and techniques that can now exploit vast amounts of internet-based training data. And some of these applications threaten privacy and security. So the question I want to start with then is what happened? Why was it that despite these early warnings, AI has been developed in ways that are really worrisome for a lot of us, both in terms of privacy and security? So of course, there's no simple answer to the question of why we didn't get a grip on this earlier, but I'm going to attempt just a partial one. And part of the answer, I think, has to do with how we even conceptualize security and privacy. So in the 1970s, information security came to refer to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information, CIA. And this understanding of security came from really primarily US military intelligence agencies. And they devoted a lot of resources to, trying to improve CIA. But it really captured a very narrow conception of what's at stake in security. Privacy, on the other hand, came to be seen as something much broader and more subjective. And it was largely seen as the domain of civil society and civil government. And so obviously privacy had something to do with the confidentiality of information, but ultimately what we care about is not just information, but how that information can be used to harm people. Much of the privacy debate, of course, is centered on the misuse of information, including erroneous or irrelevant information, to deny people access to homes, loans, jobs, and more. So in this sense, I think we can actually see violations of privacy as also being violations of human security, understood as freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom to pursue new opportunities. That was sort of the vision that people were afraid was threatened in the mid-1960s. So the tendency for us to separate security and privacy and to actually frame security and privacy as being in tension is partly a historical artifact. There's been a real and continuing debate, of course, over when a societal right to know outweighs an individual's right to privacy. And that goes beyond the scope of today's discussion. But I simply want to note that there are many different kinds of security, and privacy is not necessarily understood as being in tension with all of them. And additionally, as I want to suggest in conclusion, privacy can sometimes not just be a form of human security, but also of national security. Okay, but historically, privacy and security have been treated as sort of separate things dealt with by different federal agencies. So I want to say a lot was done on the privacy problem in the early 1970s, partly growing out of this 1960s debate about a federal data center. The 1970 Fair Credit Reporting Act provided a number of protections for consumers. The U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare chartered a study, which then articulated a code of fair information practices. Those principles were codified in the 1974 Privacy Act, which requires federal government agencies to safeguard personal information. And we also had the passage of the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. At the same time, there were some things that were very explicitly not done. So in 1977, a Federal Commission on Privacy issued this massive report, 654 pages, you can still download it online, which it detailed, quote, an overwhelming imbalance in the record-keeping relationship between an individual and an organization, meaning that basically organizations had all the power. And they recommended voluntary and mandatory guidelines that would help empower individuals and the creation of a new federal privacy board to help interpret the inevitable ambiguities that come when you pass a law. Now, this was not done. And that was revisited, the idea that we should have some kind of federal organization that would help us actually think about how to implement these, both in the private sector and in the government, so that the laws would actually be done well, implemented effectively, and that was basically rejected. And we should note that the European context and even the Canadian context, many other nations actually did take action and create these kinds of boards, which sometimes created problems for international trade because these companies didn't want to do business with US businesses that they did not know would actually safeguard certain kinds of information. So the US is kind of an outlier in its decision to not pass some of these protections. Okay, so while all this debate was going on about privacy in the 1970s, of course, the internet was growing. First, it was a government-managed network, and then from about 1990s onward, the system was managed by a combination of nonprofit and for-profit organizations. And companies discovered that they could profit, of course, by gathering data on user behavior and then selling or using that information for marketing purposes. And so when I looked for an image to describe the growth of the internet, I came across this amazing visualization of tweets of the sunrise that you can see as the day goes on. How certain kinds of tweets move across the globe. And this is seen as an example of how the internet allows this sort of easy capture of data. But of course, we should recognize that part of what's being allowed here and being publicized this kind of data has to do with decisions about govern or not regulate or not regulate corporations. So when we think about today's AI, we can really understand it as another way of capturing the surplus value of user-generated internet content. Most of the methods and algorithms that are used in machine learning today were developed in the late 1980s, 1990s, further developments in the new millennium. But the thing that really happened in the new millennium was that we had massive databases on user behavior. Certain companies, Google, Meta in particular, were really well positioned to develop AI because they could use the data that they'd been gathering on their users to train their AI models. And so, for example, last year, Meta notified Facebook and Instagram users in Europe that it would be using their public posts to train Meta's machine learning algorithm, Llama. And it gave European users an opt-out option because that was required, although it was hard to use. By contrast, Meta did not warn US users, and it did not give US users an option to opt out because it wasn't required to do that. And companies, of course, that didn't already have this kind of data ready at hand just started scraping the internet, where, again, lots of personal information was available because there was very few privacy protections on it. Okay, so I've mostly been talking about privacy. And I want to move now to talk a little bit more explicitly about security, understood in the more traditional sense as protecting individuals, companies, and governments from theft and other kinds of harm. The first thing we can note here is that machine learning, which is sort of the current wave that's getting all the attention for AI, can be used for either offense or defense. So it can be used to generate new viruses, for example, but it can also be used to defend against them more effectively. And what makes it effective really is the organization and the skills of the attacker or the defender. So it's not a sort of magic bullet that's clearly benefiting one or the other. At the same time, machine learning does enable new kinds of cyber attacks, and in particular, attacks based on deception seem to be the most effective and sort of novel offensive uses of AI. So, for example, deepfakes of Elon Musk appear to be a particularly popular way for criminals to scam people. This is a story here that starts by talking about how one healthcare worker repeatedly saw ads on TikTok and Facebook showing Elon Musk promoting an investment opportunity, and then she lost $10,000 in the scam, which she thought was credible, when it was actually a deep fake. Of course, deception can be used not just to scam individuals, but also entire polities, right? So it is likely at this point that every high-profile policymaker has been the target of one or more deepfakes, videos that are doctored to sort of portray them in a negative light. And unfortunately, these are now just a part of domestic politics. But it's also easy to see how they're going to be used in propaganda campaigns and disinformation campaigns by adversaries of the United States who want to use these to sow divisions or misinformation, which there's centuries of effort to do that kind of foreign interference. Now it's just amplified by these kinds of technology. So I think that's an example as well of how when we think about human security, we also need to think about the way that scales up to potentially affect national security, national sovereignty. When individuals can get scammed and deceived in these ways, then it actually has larger implications. So I'll just conclude by noting that I think we can think not just about the impact of AI on privacy and security, but also about the ways that our lack of privacy and security has impacted AI. So we often hear about how, the impacts that these new technologies are going to be making on security and privacy. But really, it's the lack of protection historically for the privacy of individuals and communities that has enabled the development of applications that further erode privacy and security. And of course, there's many applications of AI that don't erode privacy and security, and there's different approaches to AI that do really useful, important things in the world. And there's a very narrow subset that we're really concerned about influencing privacy and security. So we can think about our approaches to security and privacy as having equally affected AI and the development of AI, shaping what kinds of tools can be developed and what kinds of tools cannot. And I will close there and hand it off. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Slayton. And now I will turn to our third panelist, Dr. Mendon-Plasek.
Great. Well, let me also take a moment to thank my co-panelists, to thank the chair, to thank the AHA for putting this panel together. It's really exciting to be thinking about these things with all of you today. So I want to keep my remarks brief, and I want to frame my remarks around the question about how we talk about the development of AI. It's my belief that the stories we tell about how AI came to be prominent, ubiquitous, important, almost magical in its ability to predict our actions and our activities, really matters in terms of what threats we imagine it might pose to us, and also even how we conceptualize what privacy and security are. It is the case, as you've seen already, that different technologies change our conceptions of privacy and change our conceptions of security. And I want to maybe pose a hypothesis that a distinctive feature, perhaps, of sort of contemporary forms of machine learning that are popular today is that they sort of conflate privacy and security as belonging to the same family of problems. I think that has implications for how we think about threats. I think it has implications for how we imagine regulating these things. So I want to spend just a few moments talking about how we've historicized AI in the past as historians, and maybe new ways of understanding these histories in the present moment or in the past decade. So prior to the 2010s, a lot of work on the history of AI really focused on a few particular traditions that were quite prominent in the news and in popular media about what AI was and what goals they had. It focused on questions of intelligence. It often involved problems of mathematical proof proving or chess playing. And if you look at the histories of AI written in the 1980s and 1990s by professional historians, those are the sites and the problems that they focus on. It tends to see learning as a form of optimization. So you don't have a computer program learn to come up with new ideas. You have a computer program to learn to optimize on things you already know how to do as a computer scientist, right? And so it often focused on criteria for success that involved a correct answer. And as a scientist, you knew what the correct answer was, right? And I think this narrative has had several consequences about how many people today continue to think about the development of AI and how they might advance the development of AI even, right? And one is it really supports the narrative that if you want to advance AI, you fund a few groups at elite institutions and you give them tons of money, and those elite groups will advance the field, right? And so if you take this sort of narrative of development of AI seriously, as I sort of grossly sketched it, then you will see in the 1980s and 1990s that there's a huge upheaval, and that suddenly, supposedly, neural networks come onto the scene and they're able to solve the problems of previous AI systems in a much more effective and impressive way. Part of the problem with this narrative, which is almost a myth really, is that it suggests that everyone was working on the same problem, that from the 1950s to the 2010s, everyone had the same problem in mind, and it was just a question of what method was better. This leads to narratives like, well, the rise of GPUs almost inevitably made the rise of neural networks a thing that would happen, right? The part of this panelist is to point out that nothing is inevitable. This is a result of a particular set of decisions and values that we have. We're always making decisions as a society about what to do and what things we want to prioritize. So around the 2010s, a number of historians very interested in histories of machine learning began to reimagine what some of these AI histories might be. And one of the first things they discovered was rather than like a few communities that were all working on the same problem, they discovered an abundance of communities, some of which identified as working on AI, and some of which identified as working on very different things, including like electrical engineering, signals processing, pattern recognition. There were some neural network people as well, but what they saw those neural networks as capable of doing varied wildly and radically. There were as many different problems as there were methods, right? And so one of the things that historians of machine learning in the 2010s and to the present day have struggled with is how to understand these like really complicated networks of scientific development, where different people are engaging with each other, but they're not agreeing on what problems are valuable, what methods work, what criteria should constitute success. So in sort of my like closing moments, I just want to suggest like an alternative account of machine learning that has been understudied and that I think is like really important to understanding sort of the values of certain forms of machine learning in our contemporary moment. We can begin to understand that there were people working on learning programs and how they might hallucinate answers in 1949. So already in 1949, people are writing about hallucinatory programs in precisely the ways that we sort of talk about them now. I think a number of computer scientists would be very surprised to hear that this term hallucination is not a recent origin. Likewise, I think a number of computer scientists would be, and politicians, will be very surprised to learn that machine learning as a term to connote a subject and a discipline predates AI by a number of years. We often talk about machine learning as a subdiscipline of AI, and there are reasons why we might choose to do that. But importantly, machine learning predates the sort of like notion of the 1956 AI Dartmouth Conference on AI. So that's important to understand. So one of the sort of key insights I think on this history, on these alternative histories of machine learning, is that we tend to understand AI as like programs that try to learn the objective world, right? And the sort of efficacy of AI systems is often couched in their objectivity that is somehow different or better than human objectivity. Importantly, we see in efforts to like build learning programs in which learning programs might facilitate new and different answers. Uh, we see in those traditions that subjectivity is actually the justification for using these learning programs. That in fact, the world is messy and we do not understand it, and we never will understand it. Societies are complicated. They involve lots of factors that we just don't understand. And simple models just will not be able to approach a useful understanding of those things. So instead, we should focus on what actions do we take given our extremely subjective and limited knowledge, right? It's kind of a questions under uncertainty, but to like an extreme level in which you really don't assume anything about the world. You assume that your knowledge is extremely subjective and not representative. How do you make decisions in that case? Those are the kinds of systems that contemporary machine learning approaches are often drawing upon, right? So machine learning systems are subjective, and that's why they work, right? And we've seen over the past like 60 years a switch from claiming these systems were useful because they were subjective to useful because they objectively describe the world. And I think if we want to sort of understand how conceptions of privacy and conceptions of scientific development are changing in, like, say, the past 20 years and in the contemporary moment, that a good place to start is by taking seriously these efforts to build subjective learning machines, and that was an efficacious way of actually acting in the world. And so there's just a few points I want to briefly mention. One is for questions of privacy, relevant information is any information that's correlated with groups. So in some sense, if you have some protected inner life and you want to protect that protected inner life, suddenly it is the case that any information that can be gathered about you and aligned in different ways, right, as Dr. Slayton was just talking about, can suddenly reveal information that you might yourself not realize. Obviously, you can only do this if you were an actor that has like a large amount of data about a lot of people, right? And so this is where like ideas of antitrust really become to play a role in ideas of privacy. The other point I want to make about scientific development as it pertains to national security is if we take this sort of earlier notion of AI as just a few groups that were basically given blank checks to try to work on whatever problems they thought were important, we misunderstand how machine learning, certain forms of machine learning became so prominent today. That a much better and honestly much more historically defensible understanding of how certain forms of machine learning became so ubiquitous across so many different fields and became a discussion literally in newspapers pertaining national security. We really need to take seriously that its success was in part by funding a whole bunch of different groups that worked on different problems that had different kinds of methods. And those groups argued with each other and borrowed methods from each other, even stole methods from each other, and didn't ever arrive at a consensus, but arrived at a set of strategies that were useful for solving certain problems. And those problems often were rooted in, again, this notion of a subjective world that could not be understood. So as we think about how we might want to develop AI in the future, I think this counter narrative is extremely useful in imagining alternative choices that we might wish to make, rather than being sort of forced into narratives of technological determinism and the sort of inevitability of certain kinds of AI. So I don't know what my time is, but I assume I've talked for 10 minutes, so I will stop.
So first question, there seems to be a public acceptance to the loss of privacy. When did that begin?
That's a really good question, and I hesitate to give any firm answer because if I cite a particular historical moment, Sarah can probably say, "Oh no," but actually that happened earlier. I mean, I think some of Sarah's examples actually illustrate this, right? That even in the 19th century, there was a period where judges were saying, "Actually, no, you shouldn't expect to be able to control your image. You know, why should you?" A famous moment sort of post-internet is when Yahoo basically said they weren't going to be complying with certain laws because government laws, because they were beyond the state. The internet was a borderless space. And, the CEO famously said that you have no privacy, there is no privacy. And I don't know that there was acceptance at that moment, certainly not by everyone, because a lot of people got really angry about that. And there was pushback and there were, efforts to try to establish some reasonable expectation of privacy, even as the internet was getting started and was being commercialized. But I think we have seen recurring moments where certain people push for an acceptance of that. I don't know if Sarah or people who have knowledge of the earlier history want to chime in more on the question of when it started.
Yeah, it's such a big question and an interesting one to think about. I wonder if the way I have tried to think about this question is privacy as a kind of ongoing tension within a society between a tension that's really over the boundaries of how well we want to be and can be known by others. And if you think about it that way, there's sort of there's no discrete kind of quantity of privacy people have and that they give away at some point, but it's a kind of constant negotiation. And I think even our law reflects in some ways this sense of the subjectivity and the changing nature of privacy in decisions like the 1967 ruling I mentioned, which was Katz, US v. Katz, Katz v. US, which was set a kind of reasonable expectation of privacy standard, which, as you can see, has no, there's nothing defined about that. But I would say, and this is one of the points I guess I was trying to make in my short presentation, that even as people have seemed to give away or have lost privacy, they've also tried to redefine and defend it in other ways. So that actually, I think more limited understandings of what privacy was in the past have given way to very capacious demands for privacy around things that weren't imagined, certainly by, the framers of our Constitution or by earlier, architects of privacy who thought about, the quartering of soldiers or something like that, would not have imagined that information about us kept in dispersed records in computer systems across the United States could somehow be part of us and part of our privacy. So I think it's a really tough question. I think we're always losing and always trying to regain our privacy.
If I can just chime in very briefly on this, I think it's really easy. I would not want people to take away the message from this briefing that technology is always compromising privacy, because we've actually seen the development of some really impressive privacy enhancing technologies. If you look at something like public key cryptography, the vision there from the very beginning, from the 1970s, was how could you establish secret contact with someone you'd never met before that nobody else would have to mediate? Historically, if you wanted to establish a secret line of communications over open channels, like, sending your message across the wire but encrypted so nobody could read it, you'd have to physically pass back and forth a code, a cipher, so that you both knew how to encrypt your message and then send it privately. Now we have public key cryptography where you can do that. You can reach out to someone you've never met before and make sure that nobody can read your message except the two of you. And the reason that's possible is because there's been a huge amount of investment in an infrastructure that enables that. So the technology there has in some ways enabled kinds of privacy that were unthinkable at the start of the United States. So I just want to sort of balance the narrative that, technology is an incursion on privacy, because we do see both kinds of technologies being developed.
Yeah, and I just want to maybe add to these two answers. I mean, as you can see, to ask when did these concerns about privacy sort of start depends on what you think privacy is. And in some ways, and the notion of privacy is changing over time. And I just want to maybe gesture to Dr. Eagle's work about, in the beginning of the 20th century, the late 19th century, what drives these notions of privacy? Well, in part, elites being threatened by certain forms of technology, like photography, right? Suddenly they're walking in their backyard and someone's taking a picture of them, and they're like, "Hey, this is not okay," right? So new forms of technology sort of make thinkable new forms of intrusion, right? New kinds of threats that we can have. And I just want to point to maybe one other moment that's not like the only moment that's important, but maybe an interesting moment, right? The development of sort of corpus approaches like to large language, large amounts of language, right? So the internet suddenly is all this digitized language. Google's running around saying like, hey, let's collect as much language as possible. Not necessarily just because we want to do AI work, but maybe just because like we want to do certain kinds of filtering work, right? And so suddenly you start vacuuming up all this information off the internet. And the sort of claim is that was even made by humanists, right, in the 2010s, which is like, well, we're just trying to like use new methods to understand the world, right? And like you shouldn't like block off all these texts that we might want to use that we're using in a different way. So they shouldn't be covered under copyright in the same way as they were in the past. So there's real debates about what it means to have intellectual property, right? Like, what is the status of that, and like, you know, in what circumstances might we want to maybe loosen those restrictions for certain kinds of activities? So I'll just stop there, but it's a very interesting question, and it really depends on what forms of privacy you're really concerned about.
All right. Well, thank you all. So I apologize, I got kicked out, but I'm back. And thank you all for such a dynamic conversation. We have just a couple minutes left. So I wonder if, and we have some really amazing questions. So I'm wondering if each of the panelists might be able to take about 30 seconds, maybe a minute, to kind of, what is your takeaway in terms of, you know, what should the participants in this webinar, what should they leave thinking about in terms of the nature of the debates over AI, how unique they are, how do they build on what has come before, how unique are they in terms of the American policy conversations versus the international ones. And so there are a lot of different points that we've discussed, but what's the one thing that you would really want panelists to leave thinking about the stakes of this debate, the nature of this debate, that a historical lens might provide that current conversations do not have?
I can try to start. It's hard to come up with just one because I think this has been a really interesting conversation. I think the fact that these problems are not new should give us some hope. That is, there's a century and a half at least, you know, of kind of thinking, debate, legal attempts, regulatory attempts, public conversations, norm setting that are resources, a kind of archive actually for policy innovation in the present. And while I don't think we can extrapolate neatly from those historical instances or find ready-made solutions, I do think we ought to use history as and kind of historical actors solutions as a kind of resource for our present day dilemmas. I think that might actually also help us think somewhat more proactively if we look at the long run of some of these technologies, how they began, what people thought they were capable of and what they could do versus what they wound up doing. Might help us sort of project into the future and think more carefully and critically about some of the technologies we're wrestling with right now, including, of course, AI.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent summary. And I think I'll just add to that a little bit that as we're thinking about what we can learn, we can also look beyond just the United States, right? Because we have the United States as sort of its own little crucible where we try out experiments. And a lot of tech companies have really grown up in a particular environment in the United States. But actually, the industry is global now. And the United States technology competitors are global, they're international. And so we need to be thinking about how do other countries manage these issues? Can we harmonize our policies? And how will that affect the evolution of AI? So, you know, if there's one takeaway I think that all of us have been trying to suggest from the briefing, it's that there is no predetermined direction of technology, that it's shaped by historically contingent views and events. that sort of shape what kinds of technologies get invested in and what kinds don't. And I just think we need to take, I would just add that we need to take a really global lens at which is really hard because it's huge. But there's a lot of actors in the world outside of the United States who are also very directly affecting how these technologies get developed.
Yeah, and even to piggyback on that, I would say just speaking of how different forms of machine learning, different forms of artificial intelligence have developed, in the past 70 years. I would say one thing we continue to see is precisely the existence of transnational networks that are like crucial for like the development of specific kinds of methods, specific forms of AI, specific questions that are seen as important or not, right? It's not so much that one individual group suddenly excels at one particular method of AI or convinces everyone else that their method is the way to go. But in fact, it's a transnational networks that like facilitate different kinds of ideas of success. And that it's literally the existence of those ideas of success side by side by side by side, which makes certain kinds of strategies thinkable. And I just can't emphasize that enough. The part the US was so successful, particularly in what we might call AI broadly conceived, is that is in fact the US being able to bring together large networks of people from around the world to work on specific computational problems. So.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists, and I will turn it back over to Sarah Weichsel.
Thank you, Katie. Well, that concludes today's congressional briefing on historical perspectives on artificial intelligence. We hope to see those of you who are in the DC area at future briefings and encourage you to email us with any ideas for topics in the future. The AHA has nearly 11,000 members, and we can find a historian to speak on any topic. This is our 6th briefing in 2025. Recordings of our previous briefings are available to watch on C-SPAN. Those include briefings on the history of the House of Representatives, the history of deportation, the history of the Federal Civil Service, the history of tariffs, and the history of the United States Senate. If you're not already a member of the AHA, we hope that you'll consider joining to support programs like this, and you can find a link to our membership page in the chat. A recording of today's event will be emailed to you when it's available, and questions or feedback can always be sent to us at ahaonline@historians.org. Finally, I want to thank our moderator and all of our panelists for giving so generously of their time, and I want to thank our attendees for spending this hour with us. If you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to be in touch.